No doubt 2020 will be a year we will all remember in our lifetimes. Instead of a typical year review show, we'd like to break down the year into three major categories of health, politics, and social justice. Tonight, you'll hear from experts talk about each of these topics, how the events of 2020 shaped our thoughts, and what lessons we can take into the future. We start our discussion now with health. Joining us via Zoom is Sean Talley, a shock trauma ICU nurse for Intermountain Healthcare. Sean, thank you so much for joining us tonight and welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Sean, let's rewind back to when the pandemic was starting. It hit the West Coast around January. March was when schools went remote. What was going through your mind then?
You know, I don't think we really quite knew what to expect or what to make of it. I know we were all very anxious and kind of nervous, but we all knew that we had to figure out what our part to play in all that was. And as the cases slowly started to trickle into Utah, you know, it didn't take very long for us to really kind of find our niche and really get after it.
Really hit us kind of like a semi-truck, I would say. What did you and your staff plan for as the caseload grew, and how did those plans work out?
Thankfully, we worked with a lot of very intuitive people. And so as soon as the cases started coming into Utah, we can kind of see more what we were going to deal with here at home. A lot of plans were made for not just what happens when those first cases came in, but what we would do if we started to see a lot of those cases, and how we would expand our capacities, and how we would make better use of our resources and nurses that we had here. And a lot of those plans that they made early on were actually very helpful for what we're dealing with here right now.
Obviously, COVID hit us faster than we could handle. What was the biggest challenge there? Was it maybe staffing, resources, PPE? What were the biggest challenge?
You know, those are all very concerning topics, and thankfully we got right on top of it. We started getting the PPE out, and the staff, we talked to them and learned how they would best be able to help us. We're picking up extra shifts. We're teaching certain nurses how to work in ICU environment from med-surg environments, and it was very helpful. Thankfully, it was a very hands-on, helpful group effort here. We couldn't have done it if we didn't work together like we're doing now.
How does that time compare to where we are now? What does it look like in your ICU?
Well, now we're all very tired. It's been going on for some time now, but we've learned a lot, and we've learned how to continue to stretch ourselves and utilize those resources and maximize their talents and their abilities staff-wise. We've learned to be efficient and very cleanly with our PPE and our reuse of the things we can reuse. And we've learned a ton through this time. I think that experience is something you can't really learn in school. You just have to go through it, and we have been.
That's the thing. I don't know if anything in medical school could have prepared you for this. Now, is there a patient story that sticks out to you most of all? Maybe a sad, a hopeful story, or maybe one of each?
You know, it's there's a range of emotion when it comes to that. The nurses especially have been there with the doctors and seeing the good and the bad, and some people get better and some people don't. One particularly positive case, I remember a patient came in and was so sick they needed to go on ECMO, which was we have a great unit here that takes care of that. And you know, when someone is on that device, which basically like takes your lungs and heart off of your own work, and this machine does it for you. You just don't really know what goes on with them after that because they're so sick. But sure enough, not too long later, some weeks later, that patient walked past my office, and we saw them come back to our unit and continue to get better. It was astonishing how well those physicians and nurses really work together and get that patient back up and where they needed to be.
That's the thing. Working in the ICU, you see the best and worst moments that people experience. What has surprised you the most about the pandemic? Maybe the public health response, the citizenry, or how they've reacted, or maybe the virus itself?
You know, what surprised me the most, I think, about this whole thing is just kind of how much we had to grow to work together. You think you're a good team before you really get tested, but then once you are tested and you're put under a lot of strain, everyone from, you know, all employees that work together in the healthcare system have really had to learn to just work together. And I think it's without a situation like this, we wouldn't have been able to do that. And it's been very advantageous to be able to come together like that. We get so much more done more efficiently. Now that we have learned we have to use each other and rely on each other.
Sean, we have about 30 seconds left. Time for one more question. I really want to know, in your opinion, what do you think we've learned from all of this, from this year? What is something that we can take with us going forward into 2021?
You know, I think we've learned that the small little basics are super important. Being healthy all the time, primary care is so important. Getting out, eating right, exercising, that will help put you a leg up when any disease comes your way. So I think what we've learned is to just be healthier, enjoy the little moment that we have.
Yeah. Yeah, very true. I mean, there were so many things taken away from us this year that we would have never expected. Great observations. You've been hearing from Sean Talley, a shock trauma ICU nurse for Intermountain Healthcare. As one of our frontline healthcare workers, Sean, we thank you for all that you do, and we wish you a happy New Year's.
Thank you.
Welcome back to our 2020 Year in Review in Focus discussion. While the pandemic was undoubtedly the biggest event of the year, we could not forget the presidential election. A record turnout of voters, and in the end, Joe Biden defeated President Donald Trump. But the Democrats lost ground in the House, including Burgess Owens defeating Representative Ben McAdams in Utah's 4th Congressional District. Joining us now in studio to talk about the year in politics is Robert Gehrke, news columnist for the Salt Lake Tribune. Robert, thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight, and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Rosie.
Let's start with the pandemic. In your opinion, how was it handled by our leaders both nationally and locally?
Well, I think nationally throughout we've seen a lot of missteps, that opportunities that were lost, opportunities to ramp up testing, to get the response right, mixed messaging, which we also saw some of it at the local level. I think early on at the local level, we saw the community kind of come together and make the sacrifices that needed to be made to crush the curve, as it were. But as the pandemic wore on, we've really not experienced anything like this in our lifetimes, at least. We just had pandemic fatigue, things got politicized, people wanted to get back to work and were tired of making the sacrifices. And we saw things start to slip in August and September, and that huge spike that lasted in November and into this month. We're closing in on 1,300 deaths, and I think some of that could have been prevented if things had been a little bit more proactive and a little bit more unified. We've pulled ourselves apart, and it's really hard to have a unified response when people are pitted against each other.
That is true. We have never faced anything of this scope before. Now, moving to the presidential election, so much went on there, right? A lot of back and forth. I want to say there's such thing as election fatigue that we went through. What do you think is the big takeaway from it all? Or what event or part of it will have the most lasting impact going forward?
I think in the introduction you touched on it, record turnout. The turnout in Utah and nationally was huge, and a lot of people were very impassioned about it, and despite the challenges of COVID, we turned out in record numbers. I think that shows an energy behind it, but it's also kind of showed the divisiveness of the politics. I think a lot of people were motivated to vote against the other guy as much as they were in favor of their guy. And so, you know, we've got to now, after the presidential election is over and we have to transition, hopefully we can start coming together and start doing some of the things that have gone by the wayside for the past year and the past several years in the polarized political environment we're in.
That's true. We really need to move on from the past and focus on the future. Locally, the closest race was the 4th Congressional District. You know, Owens, right, overcoming and getting that victory over McAdams. So what can we learn from that race?
This one surprised me a little bit, just because the numbers looked like they were going to go in Ben's favor, but there was such huge turnout in Utah County in numbers we've not seen before. 90,000 more votes than there were 2 years ago out of Utah County in that district. And that sort of shows the shifting dynamic of the 4th District, I think, that more of it's concentrated on the south end of the Salt Lake Valley and into Utah County, less of it in, you know, the West Valley City, Taylorsville part of it. So yeah, it was a little bit of a surprise, still a very close race. Going into next year, obviously, there will be redistricting, so those boundaries are going to shift some, so the balance might be a little bit different. But, you know, Burgess Owens, I think, showed that you can win in that 4th district, which is seen as the moderate district in Utah, by running on Trump coattails, on running as a Donald Trump candidate. And again, like I said, it got people fired up and got people out to the polls in record numbers, and it worked out for them. When Democrats and Republicans both turn out their votes, Republicans win in Utah because it's such a Republican state.
All right, we have time for one more question. I really want to get this question in and hear from you on this. Okay. What are your predictions or hopes, or what are you going to be watching for in 2021? I know that's a loaded question, but I want to hear from you.
There's a lot we could cover there, right? I think one of the most interesting things to watch in 2021 is, because we're going to have this divided Senate in Washington, let's see what Mitt Romney, how he fits into that, because we saw it with the pandemic relief bill that was just signed into law this week. He was one of the architects of that, working across the aisle with some moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans. That's how we're going to have to get things done going forward, because there is going to be this close division in Washington. And if he emerges as one of those leaders, I think he could really, it could mean a lot for Utah, and he could also get a lot done for the country.
I want to say that nothing's going to top 2020, but we said that in 2019 and we jinxed it. So let's just hold on for 2021, yeah. Right?
Yep.
All right. You've been hearing from Robert Gehrke with the Salt Lake Tribune. Robert, thank you so much for joining us tonight to look back on 2020. Wishing you a happy new year.
Thank you. You as well.
Minorities, people of color, people who've been oppressed are no longer going to stand for it. That the time for change is now, and that we are willing to provide the platform, the education, and the safe space for people to learn how to make those changes.
Up next in our In Focus discussion about 2020 in review, social justice. If there's anything we can take away from this year, it was that this was the year of reckoning, when social justice movements took center stage and activism exploded across the country. Throughout the year, not only have we seen countless demonstrations and call to actions, but different acts and displays of support for marginalized communities and those facing injustice. Joining us now live in studio is Kilo Zamora, Gender Studies Professor at the University of Utah. Kilo, thank you so much for coming in, and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
What are some of the events that had the biggest social justice impacts, in your opinion, in 2020?
Well, I think we have to begin by looking at what happened with the movement of Black Lives Matter and why it was there, because of police brutality. So when we look at what happened with Bernardo Palacios here in Salt Lake City, and then we move out and more of a broader spectrum of looking at what happened with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, we began to see what we had already seen, which was a clear understanding of the way racism works with police brutality. In addition to that, the pandemic made these issues even bigger and broader. So we saw an uptick in domestic violence and an uptick in sexual assault. And so when we combined that all together, it became a storm in which people really couldn't stand any more of it.
Now, in your opinion, what kind of role did social media have when it came to 2020 social justice movements?
Isn't that an interesting question, to wonder about the ways in which we connect on social media and how it really took off? So when we look at some of our younger people, we're looking at TikTok as one of the ways in which they were getting quick information. We're looking at Twitter as a kind of a broader spectrum from our president, soon to be our former president, and the ways in which people were organizing there, but also even into other more traditional places like Facebook, Instagram, etc. But overall, what we were seeing is that people were able to get to the information quickly, and they were organizing around it. So a lot of our social justice organizers were using it as a tool to bring folks together, understand the issues, and move forward.
What kind of response did we see come from government leaders, business owners, and companies with this year's social justice movements?
Well, I think if we look specifically in Utah alone, what we saw happening on this topic was the bigger question of, can our business or nonprofit or government agency, can we make a statement about racism? And can we make a statement about equity versus equality? So we wanted to find ways, like in Salt Lake City as a government, we were trying to use equity as a lens in which to deal with the pandemic. When we look at other businesses and organizations like the University of Utah, they were trying to really make a strong, solid case for why racism was a health crisis. And so in each of those situations, what we were seeing is people getting more specific, more bold, And right now, the Utah State Office of Education is also wondering that question, can we be that bold in terms of the statements we want to put out there, which I think really helps our cause and doesn't water it down to make it seem like this is an issue about all of us. It is, but also we need to keep a very clear focus on what's happening to our BIPOC communities.
What kind of impact would you say did the pandemic have on 2020 social justice movements?
Oh, so whenever there's a disaster, what we really see is wherever there was a disparity like racism or sexism, when a disaster occurs, it makes those disparities more prevalent, more clear. So as the pandemic happened, for those that were already making less wages, for those that were doing more social reproduction in the house, for those that we saw that were exposed to more violence, all that became larger during the pandemic. And so what we were really needing was our leaders, which have been trying to step up to say, we need a very microscopic focus on our most marginalized communities to reduce those kinds of violence, because we know they get bigger during a disaster.
Professor, we have time for one more question. What do you think are some of the lessons that we've learned with what happened in 2020 and something that we could bring forward as we move into 2021?
I love that question, Rosie. I think the big thing for me right now that I'm focused on, that I'm seeing in the community, is the difference between a non-racist and an anti-racist. A non-racist is someone who says, I don't see race, or I never work about bias and bigotry, and I'm not a racist person. But an anti-racist is someone who's working actively against racism. And so people are really thinking deeply, am I complicit into saying that I'm a good person, or am I someone who actually participates and finds ways to get out there and move this agenda forward, which is the agenda of racial justice for all, not some.
Well said. It's not enough to just not participate in it, but to also stand by and not do something. That's really what we have to think about.
You've got it.
All right, you've been hearing from Kilo Zamora, Gender Studies Professor at the University of Utah. Professor, thank you so much for joining us tonight and helping us look back on 2020. We wish you a Happy New Year.
Thank you.